Hi everybody, it's Rob here from Glas Data, and today I'm going to show you how to create visualizations in your GlasCore account. And we're going to make a dashboard exactly like you're seeing here, dedicated to carbon dioxide. So to give you a quick overview of what this data looks like, if I jump into the My Data section, you'll see that I have a topic here called CO2, and if I go inside that, you'll see I have two assets, one called CO2.1 and the other called CO2.2. And if I go into one of those sensors, you can see that I have 185 data points and just one column called CO2. Now this was live readings from a CO2 sensor, and you can see that it stopped on the 5th of October at just after midday, so 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And that is the data that we're using to pull into this dashboard. Now you can use as many different data sources as once. You can be comparing CO2 with water, with productivity, whatever you like. But for the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to be focusing specifically on the CO2 data. So if you want to make these visualizations, you need to navigate to the Create Visualizations tab, which is the second one down on the left, and click there. And then you'll see this screen. Now there's quite a lot going on here, but I'm going to go through each section individually. So hopefully by the end of it, it should be fairly straightforward. The first thing that you need to do is decide whether you're going to be creating a time series or a latest value chart. Now, a time series chart is where you have the dates and times at the bottom on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis you have the values of the things that you're plotting. And these are typically line graphs or bar graphs. And then the latest value chart is where you have dials showing exactly what the most recent reading from that sensor was. So to begin with, we're going to create a time series chart. And once you've decided that chart type, you now need to select the source of the information. So I have 4 different sources of information. And I'm going to focus on carbon dioxide. And then when you select one, it will show you the columns which are available. And I only have one column here, and that's the carbon dioxide column. And I simply drag that onto the central panel, and it'll prompt you to drop it. And you'll see that we've now added a row to this column customizing thing at the bottom, which has got color, the name of the topic, the name of the column, whether it's a line or an area graph or a bar graph, and also whether we're going to be averaging or totaling data. And you can remove these simply by hitting the X, and then you can add them back on just by dragging on again. So the next thing I need to do now is choose a name for this visualization, and this is just going to be basic CO2 averages over time. Then it's asking me whether I want to include hidden assets in the chart. Now in this account I don't have any hidden assets, but there is a possibility in my data to hide either topics or assets that you don't want to see every time you go into that. And by default, when you create visualizations, those hidden assets are not going to be included in charts, but you can specifically say to the system, I would like to include those. So that's when you want to check that checkbox. And if at any point you are confused about what each of these sections are asking you to do, there's a little information icon that you can click on, which will give you a quick description of what this thing is and perhaps whether you want to use it or not. Now the next thing we need to do is select our dates. So we have 2 items here, and I'm going to jump straight to this thing at the bottom here, which is the date range. Okay, so this is a from date and a to date. And again, I can hit the eye icon and it'll explain what it's asking you to do. And all I do is I hit the pencil icon in the middle, and then I'm going to say I want the data to go from Sunday the 3rd of October until Monday the 4th. And it starts at exactly midnight when it became the 3rd, and it ends at 1 millisecond to midnight on the evening of the 4th. So we get the full range of data. And I'm going to hit confirm. And then we have this choice between active and inactive data. Now, active data is when you want to see always the latest snapshot of information. So perhaps you always want to see the last 24 hours from a live sensor. So what will happen is if you log in at 3 in the afternoon, it'll show you the last 24 hours. You can log in then the next day at 10 in the morning, and it will have moved the chart forward to show you only the last 24 hours. Now in this case, our data is not active because the sensor is no longer reporting. So I'm going to click inactive. And that means that we will always see just the data between the 3rd and the 4th of October, and it won't move it on for us automatically. Now we need to specify the time margins. Now this is how often do we want a point on this chart. Now this sensor was reporting every 30 minutes, so I'm going to ask for a data point every 30 minutes. But let's say that we wanted to average perhaps the readings for every 4 hours. I could simply set this to be 4 hours. set this to be 0 minutes. And it will then average that information and give us 1 point every 4 hours. But for this purpose, I'm going to set this back to every 30 minutes, so we get a good granular reading. It's then asking us a few questions about time margins, x-axis, and the default asset selection. I'll come back to that in a second, but just for the time being, I'm going to put this onto all, and I'll explain why I did that. But we're now going to preview that visualization. And you can see we now get a line graph. Now what this is doing is it's taking the data from both of those CO2 sensors for every half an hour. It's averaging those readings, and it's then creating a point on the graph, and you can then see what the value was at any given time. And we can change the color of this. Let's say that we want to make this orange. We can change the color of this, and we can customize it however we want. Now if I want to see just the first sensor, so this would be CO2 sensor number 1, I can change that default asset selection back to first, and you'll notice when I then preview it, we get a slightly different line graph. Okay, now this is completely up to you how you want to do this. It can be quite useful just to visualize one at a time, and when you have it on the dashboard, you can actually specify exactly which sensor you want to be plotted. But let's say I want to plot this graph only for one specific sensor all the time. I can then go into the asset list toggle, and that's this little button at the top left-hand corner on the visualization settings. And it's going to show me all of the assets which are currently being used to make this graph. Now by default, there's going to be none selected. So what that means is that everything's being used, and when new things are added, so let's say we added another CO2 sensor, so we have CO2 sensor number 3, that would automatically appear on the graph, and we wouldn't have to do anything to it to add that in. But let's say I want to dedicate this graph just to the CO2 sensor number 2. I can select that, and then I can hit the preview visualization, and you can see we get a slightly different graph. That's because it's from a different sensor. And then perhaps actually I want to dedicate this to just CO2 sensor number 1. And again, we get a different graph because we're using a different data set. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it unselected so that it automatically uses all the data from any sensor in there. And I'm also going to keep this as using all assets. So what we're looking at is we're looking at average readings. Let's say these CO2 sensors are placed quite close together. We're then just going to get average readings for the area in which they were placed. Now then, let's say that I would like to see these sensors, again, all together on the same graph. But what I'd actually like to do is I'd like to see them overlaid on top of each other. So I want to see 2 lines here, one from each sensor. Now this is where we come to the x-axis settings, and we have a few options here. We have time margins, is what we're seeing here. That's just default time on the bottom, sensors on the y-axis. We have asset view, which I'll come to in a second. And then we have separate assets. Now what this means is it's asking the system to separate out each asset onto its own line. So if we now preview that visualization, you can see that we have the first sensor with a blue line. It'll now ignore the color because it's going to be generating multiple lines. So we've got the first CO2 sensor on a blue line, and we have the second CO2 sensor on a yellow line. So now you can overlay lots and lots of different assets on top of each other and see how they differ from each other. And you can actually see that there are correlations between these, but they're not exactly the same. So it's quite useful. Now, if you have perhaps 5 or 10 different sensors or assets, this is quite useful. But if you've got hundreds and hundreds, you might end up with quite a messy graph here. So it's important just to see, to choose the right settings for the right graph. And then the final option we have here is then asset view. Now what asset view it's asking the system to do is to plot the average for those 2 days for every single asset and compare them side by side. So if we preview these, you can see that we've got CO2 1 on the left and CO2 2 on the right. So we no longer have dates and times. We just have the average reading for that entire 48-hour period. And it looks a bit weird as a line. So I'm going to set this to be a bar graph. And there we go. So we can now see there is a small bar there. It's just a little faint one. So you can see that CO2-1, the average reading for that 48-hour period is 1058.02 parts per million. And CO2 number 2 is 1163.67 parts per million. And I can also change that to be the total readings, so the total amount of CO2 recorded. So I have 98,000 there, and I have 101,000 there. But I'm going to keep this at average for now. So there we go. That's pretty much absolutely everything in terms of time series, and it's quite you can combine these settings in any different way that you want to really create any kind of time series chart that you want. But I'm going to quickly show you how to now visualize this data in latest value, which can be quite useful if you just want a snapshot of exactly what's happening right now. So all I have to do for this is to change the chart type to latest value. And you'll notice that all of the settings that we set up have now been reset. That's because they're very different. So we now need to drag CO2 back onto that central panel. And you'll see we just get a single, we don't really have any options here. It's because it's just doing latest values. We've kept the name of the chart. We don't want to include any hidden assets, but we do have the option to here. And now we have the presentation type. So we have 6 different presentation types, and I'll take you through each one. And the first and most basic is just what we call value display. And if we preview this, you'll see that we now just get a little dial for each sensor and then the latest reading that came from that. Now we know that that reading is in parts per million, so we have a custom measurement unit down the bottom here. So we can just type ppm in there, and now when we preview the visualization, you'll see that it has ppm set as the unit there. And again, we can change the color. And we can also say, perhaps I only want to see the first asset, or perhaps I only want to see CO2 number 2. And there we go. So you can change this around in a very similar way to the time series charts. But I'm going to keep this as visualizing both of those CO2 sensors. There we go. And I'll change that back to blue. Now the next value type that we have is a speedometer. Now this takes a maximum and a minimum value, so the minimum parts per million is always going to be 0, and for the purposes of this demonstration, the maximum of parts per million is around 2000. And if we preview that, you can see we get these sort of dials, these speedometers, and these will update and change as the CO2 data comes in. So this is very useful for any kind of reading where there's a maximum and a minimum, and if it goes too close to the maximum you can set warnings, or if it goes too close to the minimum you can set warnings. Temperature gauges are a very good example of this. We also have a water gauge. Now this is dedicated to visualizing things like levels of water. So if I preview this, you'll see that we have a percentage reading. So if our maximum value is 2000 and our minimum is 0, it will say how full, for example, a water meter is. So it's not very useful for CO2, but it's very useful for measuring levels and things like that. We also have 2 visualization types dedicated to our feed silo monitoring system. So we have silo bars. Now our feed track system actually measures how much feed is left in a silo in tons, and then it'll automatically go up and down. So again, it doesn't make much sense to use this for carbon dioxide, but it gives you an idea of the different types of visualization that we have. So there's a solid version of it as well. And then finally we have a compass. Now a compass is specifically for if we have a wind vane giving readings from 0 to 360 coming into the system. So it's obviously not going to work for CO2 data, but if you do have a wind vane that's hooked up to the system, this will update to show you the direction of the wind. And it'll also have a reading, whether it's northwest, southwest, or that sort of thing as well. And that's all there is to it. Now we're constantly adding new visualization types to the system. And if you have any questions or feedback or requests, do get in touch at hello@glasdata.com. But in the meantime, have a happy time creating visualizations and happy dataing.